get on up.
Well, you managed to survive the introduction, so I'm hopeful we'll get through my presentation as well. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you. Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, thought he could speak French very well. And he told the then President of France, Jacques Chirac, that he would like to conduct the press interview in French. During the course of the interview, the question was asked in French, "Are there any positions of the French president you desire to emulate?" He thought he was saying, "There are many positions of the French president I desire to emulate." What he actually said was, "I desire the French president in many different positions." Oh, I'm sorry, I just need my glasses. Sunders, could you get them out of my top pocket? Otherwise I'm going to be stuck. When I was asked to talk today, that I was talking in the middle of the afternoon, and there were going to be a lot of speakers before me that would be bringing you up to speed with all sorts of developments in the industry. So when it came to deciding my topic, I actually thought I would go a slightly different direction. And on Sunday, it'll be 25 years since I've been in the business, 23 and a half of them spent at the Jupiter Drawing Room. And I thought it might be interesting for you if I was to share with you some of the things that I've learned along the way with the Jupiter Drawing, the good things, the bad things, the things I think we did right, and the things I think we've done wrong. And I'm hopeful if I do that, and there's anybody in the audience who's thinking of starting their own agency, it may have some value to them. Because if just one of you hears the talk today and thinks, you know, that's something I really would like to do, then my talk has been worth it. I've called it a whiskey session because the idea, it's like we're sitting down and having a whiskey together. And I realize I'm probably selling this short because I'm not offering you all a whiskey right now. You're just going to have to forgive me for that. You know, I wouldn't have started in this business if someone wasn't prepared to share. And this man, who looks like he's in his mid-40s on the cover, wrote this book when he was in his 70s. It's David Ogilvy, the legendary ad man. And he was prepared to share the secrets of what made a great advertising agency. I read that book from cover to cover in one sitting, and the second I closed it, I knew two things. I wanted to be a copywriter, and I wanted to have my own ad agency. And the day you decide to start an ad agency, and my friends from Joe Public are here, they're also from an entrepreneurial independent agency, and they will understand this very well. You sacrifice a lot. You give up the big offices and the expensive high-rises, and you move into humble surroundings, and you don't get much more humble than this. But one of the challenges you'll face if you start your own agency is how do you stand out from everybody else? And you have to constantly ask yourself that question. You don't have a lot of money, but how do you stand out? And one of the things when we started Jupiter that occurred to me is that we're supposed to be in a creative industry, and yet everybody names themselves after the partners in the agency. And when the partners in the agency die, everybody names them after the initials. So what happens is you have a string of letters for creative companies that are supposed to be distinctive. No. So when it came to choosing the name of this agency, I was reminded of a Guy de Maupassant short story in which there was a house in Normandy in Paris. It was actually a house of ill repute. And all of the local tradesmen were taken downstairs and entertained, but all of the dignitaries were whisked upstairs to the Jupiter Drawing Room. And that is where the name of the agency came from. And service was assured, as I'm sure you can imagine. One of the things that happened early on is that we spent our entire budget for boardroom furniture on just one item of the furniture, which is this leather Chesterfield. And to make it work for itself, I'm going to get to that in a second. We also started, because we're in Africa, go figure, with a Latin expression. Rem tene verba sequenter. Grasp the subject and the words will follow. And that was our guiding mantra for many years. I don't know if you've heard this story, but there was a grandfather who used to walk with his children, with his grandchild, to the fairground. And as he walked towards the carousel, he would see that it had beautiful lights and this beautiful music. But when he got up close, he saw how disappointed his grandchild was, because in fact, the thing was scruffy, and it was only the rides on the outside that went up and down. The ones inside didn't, and he felt that they were cheating the children. So he vowed that he would start his own children's park, where he would build it so that kids were never disappointed. Now, he could have written that mantra down in 10 pages, what he was trying to do, his mission statement. But he chose just one line. And this is what it is. No cracked paint and all the horses jump. And his name was Walt Disney. And I have never to this day heard a better summation of what a company stands for than that one line that applied to his. So you need to try and work on it if you open an agency, and I hope you do better than we did, because I still don't have one. One of the things we used to do right at the beginning of the agency's life is we used to ask clients to undergo this exercise, and I don't know if you've got any paper or pens, but if not, do it mentally. We'd say to a client, they'd be sitting in our boardroom, draw a man on the beach, and we'd give them pens and papers. And we'd wait a few minutes, and then we'd say, right, show us what you've drawn. And sometimes they would draw a man on the beach like this, and sometimes they draw him like this, and sometimes they draw him like this. But what we'd say to them is, if you get the brief, draw a man on the beach, do something like this. Because it's unexpected. But if it only had to be unexpected, you could do your print ads and run them upside down. So it also has to be relevant. And we believed that everything needed to be executed with a sense of style, because that would be one of the hallmarks of our agency. And it's odd that for 10 years, we used to do that exercise with the clients that came into the boardroom every day. Well, every day. We had about 3 visitors a year, actually. But just to tell you a little anecdote, we had this new strat guy who'd been with us a couple of months, and he asked if he could present the credentials. So I said, sure. So I'm sitting in the meeting with a client, and this slide comes up. So he says, right, well, creativity isn't everything, obviously, because we have media and we have strategy and we have everything else. And then he clicks the next slide, and it says this. So it was somewhat embarrassing for him. But this is the other thing that we used to put all of our store by. If you start an agency, what are you going to stand for? And for us, it was simple. We were going to stand for creativity. The first ad that we ever did, and when you've got an agency and you're starting out, you've got to take opportunities as they come. And some of this work looks a bit dated now, but it's the principles that I'm really trying to tell you. So we got briefed to do an ad for a restaurant. And all restaurant ads are the same. There's a sort of bad shot of people sitting having food, or if they can't afford models, it's just a bad shot of tables and chairs, and a logo. And we actually went and did research, rem tene verba sequenter, and found that this restaurant we were supposed to be advertising had actually got a companion restaurant in Italy. And the gentleman there heard they were opening this restaurant in South Africa, and he came out and paid a visit. And there was the start of our ad. How far will you go to try out a new restaurant? And it won our first ever Loerie. And you know, when you're starting out, you have to take the opportunities where you find them. We had a client who came to us with very little money and said, I want to advertise Doc Martens boots. And he was trying to get women to wear them. And this campaign we did was so successful, he had to start building a new plant and running it through the night. And then he woke up one day and no one wanted Doc Martens boots anymore. But it was good while it lasted. And it was particularly good for us because this became the first South African ad ever to get into a thing called the D&AD Annual. So this helped our reputation enormously. And then we got this incredible challenge because there was a Spanish or a South American drink, and Coca-Cola came to us and they said, would you like to handle this brand, but we don't have any money? Well, we have a little bit, but we don't have very much. We said, yeah, we'll have it whatever. Yeah. And the thing that was quite interesting is that the brand manager that gave us this was leaving. So he approved whatever we showed him. So we did this campaign that I don't think at the time the Coca-Cola company would have believed possible in terms of a direction. In fact, I know they wouldn't because I got a phone call after it ran. This was the ad we did for them.
Tastes like nothing. Ascot's nothing. Tastes like Fresca. Fresca, the great citrus soft drink.
And because we had a model and we had a set, we thought, why not do a second ad?
Tastes like Fresca. Conclusive proof that nothing tastes like Fresca. Fresca, the great citrus soft drink.
So we didn't have a very big budget for that. And I got this phone call from Atlanta, which is the headquarters of Coca-Cola, and the guy said, hey, you the schmuck that handles my advertising for Fresca? So I said, possibly. He said, yeah, well, what the hell do you think you're doing, man? I'm paying you money to tell people that my drink tastes like nothing. Are you crazy? No. Anyway, this campaign ran, and we did it all with a really low budget. We actually did
Stop
a series
about
of ads.
something. Think about nothing. Like what Willie Shakespeare has much ado about. Nothing. Like what you say to your mum when she says, what you doing with those girly mates? Nothing. Like what Bob Dylan remembers about the 60s? Nothing. Like what Frank Bruno did to Mike Tyson? Nothing. Like what Sharon Stone wears for money? Nothing. So, what's all this got to do with a great citrus soft drink called Fresca? Simple, ain't it? Nothing. That's because nothing tastes like Fresca.
You can tell that it's dated because when he says, like, what does Sharon Stone... Did you hear it? Yeah. Well, you wouldn't want to see Sharon Stone without her clothes on now, I would wager. And the last ad we did in the series is actually the cheapest ad in the history of advertising. This aired on national television.
Oi! What you think you're looking at? Looks like nothing, right? Well, you're right. It is nothing. And what does nothing remind you of? Simple, ain't it? A great citrus soft drink called Fresca, right? That's cause nothing tastes like Fresca.
Thank you. But you know, in those early days of having an agency, I said you have to take every opportunity you can. And a few years later, we had a dream brand that came into the agency, and we did another ad, which didn't have much of a picture and cost very little. And it got gold at the one show, and this was it. Thank you. And you'll find if you're a young entrepreneurial agency and you get a brand that is as great as a brand like Nike, you should say your prayers of thanks every night because it defined our agency for 7 years. And we had a client that, although we were in South Africa and Nike was handled at Wyden and Kennedy in Portland, Oregon, he allowed us to do all of the work for South Africa. And that work included work for the Paralympics, where we had lines like, "It's okay to stare, it's hard not to when you're looking at a world record holder. It's okay to feel sorry for him, he missed gold by 100th of a second. Feel awkward around him? You're probably playing him in the semi-final." And we did wheelchair parking bays, where we just, when the Paralympics went to, the team went to shopping centres, we doctored the. And this ad, proud sponsors of the SA Wheelchair Marathon Team, Paralympics 2000. Now, we didn't have much budget, and this is the point I want to make to you. One of the defining qualities of a great agency, particularly in its early years, is its willingness to do a great deal of work even when the client hasn't asked for it. If the client says, "I want a poster for the Paralympics," which is essentially what we were told, we persuaded them to execute a number of elements so that we could get maximum impact and they could get maximum PR. And we were actually fortunate enough to be given the chance to do the first ever Nike ad to run on the continent of Africa. And that's a huge responsibility, and we had none of their great stars from overseas, so we had to think of an African theme. And if you have to think of Nike in Africa, what do you think of? What sport more than anything else defines Africa? It's running, isn't it? So we did this ad. We had Nike for 7 years, and in that time, they let us do work that won 16 Lions at Cannes, including 12 golds. And then the day arrived when I got a phone call from the client to say they'd got a new marketing director and he wanted all the work to be done out of Amsterdam for Nike. But we were entitled to go and repitch for the business. So we walked into the room and he said, "Are you ready to set up?" And we handed him a letter. And we said, "Would you mind reading this aloud?" And he read the letter, and the letter was our resignation. I've probably cried 3 times in my life in advertising, and that day was one of them. So one of the things you need to know about advertising is that it can be tough because you can lose clients when you don't deserve to. And it happens a lot. And the one thing we've got to try and do as an industry is make sure that we do ads here rather than have ads foisted upon us from overseas. And, you know, if you say, "But do we really need to? Can't we just run an ad from overseas? It saves the client money." I'll point to a campaign that our Cape Town office did recently for a Unilever brand that is this.
Ooh, just one small cap is enough. Ooh, or more liquid. Just one small cap is enough.
Now, I don't think they would have come up with that idea in Europe. I might be wrong, but I don't think they would have done. And you know, those slappers, they produced 1 million of them, and 1 million product samples were distributed across South Africa, and that product won Product of the Year. So we as an industry need to fight hard to defend our turf, that we should be able to be making international ads that for international brands locally, because we can and because our industry is good at it. You know, I said to you earlier on that we used to say creativity isn't everything, it's the only thing. I don't believe that anymore. But I do believe, and I don't believe it because I think creativity is the most abused word in the English language next to love. So we stop talking about creativity now. We say to clients, you know, we talk innovative thinking. Because innovative thinking is actually what we do. I don't know how many of you heard the old thing about how many people does it take to change a light bulb? How many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? 1, but the light bulb's really got to want to change. So, how many creative people does it take to change a light bulb? Does it have to be a light bulb, is the answer. And you know, that is all about what we do as creative people, and that is that we ask questions, often naive questions, but we ask them because we're programmed to ask those types of questions because it's inherent in a creative mind. Sir Norman Foster, who is a British architect of some renown, said the greatest compliment he'd ever been paid was when his client said about him, he asks the right questions. And that is what we do. You know, that's at the heart of our motto, grasp the subject and the words will follow. And there's a thing called heuristic bias, which is a word which means that people think in familiar patterns and in familiar ways. Their minds go down the path most well trod. And what creative people do is they avoid that. They're not interested in that. So if you're a business or a client or a company, get creative people around the table and give them a problem to solve. And you'll find that the way that creative people think, they will come up with some really, really interesting and unusual answers. I was briefed recently when I was overseas to judge some work for a project called 1 Million Trees in New York City. And it was actually Mayor Bloomberg's initiative, and what they were trying to do was to get 1 million trees planted by the year 2016. And they put out a competition to say, could people please come up with the best ideas and the best ways of doing that? The best solution that I came across by far was a guy that had this idea. I mean, some people were saying, why don't we do all these posters, which seems a little bit self-defeating. You know, we're trying to plant trees and we're chopping them down to make the posters to get people to plant them again. But this guy said, I've got a thought. Why don't we take the turnstiles in each of the subway stations, and we have one turnstile that's green, and you pay a little bit more money when you go through this one. And he'd worked out that if this is the New York subway, 5 million people a day travel on it. So 5 million users a day. If 10% use the green lane at a 50-cent premium, that's 50,000 people per day. That's 250,000 per week. That's $125,000 a week. That's $6.5 million a year. And over a 10-year period, they would make $65 million. And for me, that is one of the best examples of what we do. It doesn't cost a lot of money, and it defies the familiar ways of thinking and working. And you know, we see it all the time. You've seen it here today, I'm sure. We are now in an age where we have to be more inventive and more creative and more innovative in the thinking we have for clients beyond advertising. And this installation is one example of what our Cape Town office did, and there are many others that show how our innovative thinking is extending way beyond the traditional boundaries. How am I doing for time? Am I halfway? Huh? More than halfway. Okay. So I want to make this a warts and all presentation. I'm going to quickly show you an ad I did that I confess was wrong. This is it. It's for a company called, it's for the CSAR. Have you heard of them? They're in Pretoria. They're a big research-based company.
They said, the man who believed he could break the land and water speed records in 1 year was a fool or a dreamer.
There's no going back in life. You start something, you've got to finish it.
there is a universal truth his critics chose to ignore. When you take the conviction of science, a man of courage, and the imagination of both, all things are possible. 7 minutes before dusk, on the last day of the year, they proved to all men that if it can be imagined, it can be done.
So, what an idiot. What an idiot I am. Because whilst the ad has a certain evocative appeal, I look back at it now and I think it was grossly irresponsible to take an organization as brilliant as the CSIR and fail to find advertising that could somehow reflect what they do actually do. Because if you meet these guys, they're all geeks and weirdos, but they do the most incredible things, like they design camera lenses that don't exist anywhere else in the world that are like incredible. So the thing for me, and we did 3 in this series. You know, there was one, I haven't got the sound on this, but there was one with Thomas Edison, and it was really about saying imagination is more important than knowledge, but it was wrong to take people from another country that have done things and by association claim that it was ours. And now I hate that. Whenever I see an ad where someone is just riding on the back of something that's happened overseas and they use it for their own advertising, I think it's lazy, and I think it's a few other things too. But ironically, they say that there's always one example that disproves the rule, and my favorite ad of all time did just that. 4 years after we did this campaign, and I'm not by any means saying they cribbed this idea, but isn't it interesting that this ad ran?
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them, but the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
Is that or is that not a genius ad? Won't you give it a round of applause? And you know what's particularly clever is the use of their voice artist. It's Richard Dreyfuss, and if you listen to the way that he delivers those lines, it's unlike any voice artist that's paid to do voice work would ever do it. He's an actor, and he emphasizes completely the wrong words in the wrong places, but it is and remains a genius ad. And I have this incredible, vision that someone says, Steve, we're planning to sell the most exciting computer company in the world with grainy old stock footage of people who are dead before Apple opens its doors for business. Neat, says Steve. And the great thing about Steve Jobs is what a purist he was. And I just love that about the guy. They say that when Walter Isaacson wrote this book on Steve Jobs said, you can ask anybody anything. You can talk to anybody. I don't want to know what you want to write. Say good, bad, indifferent. The only thing I'm going to ask you is that you let me design the front cover because I want it to be white. I want to tell you about something that is the worst thing that ever happened to my agency. You know the expression, when the gods want to punish you, they answer your prayers. And in 2006, in July, we won South African Airways. Why is everyone laughing? And a bit later on that year, Sasol put their business out for pitch. And we were put on the shortlist. And then a little bit later, ABSA put their business out for pitch, and we were put on the shortlist. And then a little bit later, MTN, one of the biggest advertisers in South Africa, put their business out for pitch, and we were on the shortlist. We were the only agency to be invited to pitch for all 3 pieces of business. And it wasn't just 3 clients, it was 3 clients on 3 consecutive days for 3 pitches in December. And we couldn't decide whether to go for it or not, so we got our staff together, and the staff said, we said to them, look, you know, if we go for all 3, we're probably not going to get any, but you tell us what you want to do. And they said, we actually want to go for it because no one's ever done it before, it'd be great. So there followed probably the most intense 7 or 8 weeks of our lives, and the result was that we won all 3 accounts. And to give you some idea of the size, that is like winning R1 billion. It'd probably be equivalent to about 1.5 million rand today, but that is like winning. That's like winning, you know, 100 million rands worth of business a month. And we had to put on 100 people in 4 weeks. It took us 19 years to grow the agency to a particular size. The next day, we were more than double that size. And you know, there's a story that I will give you that's related to this, and it's that of a French restaurant. We were a French restaurant. You know, we did beautiful work. It was crafted. It was lovely. And it's like someone comes to your restaurant and says, you know, in 6 months' time, can you serve 3,000 covers? You say, well, that sounds like a challenge. Yeah, we'll try. And you do. And then you wake up 6 months later and you find you've become a fast food chain. Which is fine. Fast food's fine. But it's not fine when you want to be a French restaurant. So my caution to you, and people say, oh, it serves you right, you were greedy. But what they don't realize is the only reason we pitched for all of that business is because people said it was impossible, not because the money was there. So a word of caution, and it's taken us a long time to try and get through that spell of dealing with that huge change to our culture, but I think we're getting back there now. We did Chesterfield ads to celebrate it. Every now and then it's a good idea to sleep on it. Before, after, no changes. Ha! What a laugh that is. And you know, Sir Martin Sorrell, who I'd spoken to 5 years before, who heads up WPP, didn't want to buy into the Jupiter drawing because he thought making R1 million profit was pathetic. 5 years later, I get a phone call from him saying, I'm reporting you to the Monopolies Commission, let's talk. And then he offers to invest and buy 49% of our agency for a lot of money. So the problem with that is he's only interested when you're big. He wasn't interested when we were good and small. Okay, so how long have I got? Okay, I'm going to wind up now, team. Thank you. A few observations shared. Would you believe it? It's a word that I like to use in my agency often. I like us to feel that we're challenged and we're doing stuff. So it's big stuff sometimes. When Ad Age said, oh, you're one of the top 5 most creative agencies in the world, would you believe it? Agents of the Decade, would you believe it? World's leading independent agencies, would you believe it? And, you know, we then start running ads, double-page spreads in magazines like the Cannes Lions Daily. No agency in the world does that. We ran double-page spreads promoting South Africa. Where exactly is the top of the world? Oh, by the way, it's South Africa. When the World Cup was on, it's a pretty good place to be right now. So suddenly we're saying, yeah, would you believe it? Here we are, this tiny little agency, and now we're doing work that's kind of more for the country or for South Africa than it is just for us. And you know, last year we even offered, I can't believe this will be leaving my cellar, a case of Bollinger champagne for the agency that wins the first Cyber Gold at Cannes. And you know, that's another would you believe it moment. Would you believe it that we're actually doing that? And and then Churchill's Chesterfield comes up for auction. Now, if you like Chesterfields, what are you going to do? Unfortunately, you get in a bidding war with an American collector and you end up selling the family silver to buy it. And it was a bit tatty, so it had to be restored. But the point I make is, it's a would you believe it? Would you believe it when we bought the Chesterfield that one day we would have Winston Churchill's Chesterfield in our offices? And that's the thing that some
people prefer footscaling a ramp, or maybe grinding the pavements. But me, I like foot skating in nature. A relationship with nature is actually quite personal. In fact, I don't even like to talk about it, but I will a little bit. You know, when I'm in nature, it's almost like I feel like I'm home. And in fact, in many ways, I am almost home because, I mean, I live just down there, near the park.
So, you know, we have guys who say, MTV lets you send ads in, let's do some. So they take a month and they write some ads, and the next thing you know, they're making a movie. Would you believe it? You know, 15% of our awards to date. Would you believe it? And there's this lovely story that David Ogilvy told in his book, I don't know if you're aware of it, where he said, when he has a new manager in one of his offices around the world, he sends them a Russian doll. And when you take one off and the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one, you get down to one tiny one. And when you take that, there's a little scrolled up message. And when you read the message, it says, if we employ people that are smaller than us, we will become a company of dwarfs. But if we employ people that are bigger than us, we will become a company of giants. And the great thing when you have an agency is if you can find people to share that vision and open other offices. And we've been so lucky. We've got amazing people in Cape Town. We've got this incredible guy who's up in Zimbabwe who, I mean, he just sleeps, lives and eats and breathes and sleeps creative work. And you know what's funny is he started from a little house. So the story begins anew. So my point in concluding is, would you believe it is a question you need to be able to ask your agency every single year? You need to be able to say, did we do something this year that when we started we would say, would you believe it? And if it's, would you believe it, we got a finalist at Pendoring, you're not on the right track. It's got to be something, would you believe it, that makes you really excited. And you have to set that bar. You have to be the one that says, what are we going to do next year that's a would you believe it moment? Would you believe it? We have an annual photograph every single year since we've started the agency. So we record what we do because brands tell stories. And if you have an agency, as my friends of Joe Public will tell you, we have an obligation to record that story. But you can't live in the past. And this is, I think, my final slide. The one thing I'd say to you about an agency, particularly one that's 15, 20 years old, is you're not Justin Bieber anymore. You're now George Clooney. That's not a bad thing. But you've got to remember that it's all about now. Because the past is just there to inform the present. The present is what will determine the future. And without now, there won't be a future worth having. So my final advice to you is, when you have an agency, however long it goes for, however big it gets, always remember the people you have in it today and the work that you do today is going to be the work that will either make you or break you. And the carousel, you know, Walt Disney said when they interviewed him many years after he opened Disney World, and I'm showing you one of my heroes, Robin Putter, here, because he was the head of a great agency that was very big, still is. And Walt Disney said, you know, they interviewed him 15, 20 years after he opened Disneyland, and he said, it wasn't starting Disneyland that was hard. What was hard was living up to the dream every single day thereafter. And my hat goes off to Robin and to Ogilvy. We lost agency of the decade to them in 2001, and I felt cheated. But when I thought about it, I thought, they deserve it because it's hard to make a big agency keep going. And a sense of wonder is what you need. And it's one that we try and have every day. It's a would you believe it thing. And even today, I'm here and I say, would you believe it? Jupiter drawing rooms between Unilever and Google. And it's not Google anymore, but you know what I'm saying? It's like, would you believe it? And it's still the same excitement and it's still the same thrill. Thank you very much indeed.